Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching our panel, Is Everyone Sick of the News? I'm Emma O'Brien, Head of Product Strategy for Bloomberg News. And joining me today are Marcus Mabry, Vice President of Global Programming for CNN Digital, Craig Newmark, founder of Craigslist and Craig Newmark Philanthropies, and Lauren Williams, co-founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Capital B. Thank you all for being here. You all have extremely varied perspectives and loads of experience in our industry, and I'm just really excited to jump right into it. As we all know, the events from the last year have been, quite frankly, exhausting. Between a global pandemic, the presidential election, and what would turn out to be Donald Trump's last year in office, the death of George Floyd and the civil activity that inspired, climate-related weather catastrophes, an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, and who knows what else by the time this airs. It's a lot to take in, even for us, and we're news junkies who live and breathe this stuff. So the bar is higher for other, more casual and perhaps more passive consumers of news content. I don't think we'll be able to fix the future of news in the next 45 minutes, but at least we can tackle some of the big themes that we as an industry are up against. So Marcus, let's start with you. How do news organizations serve an audience that's overstimulated by push notifications, social media, and exhausted with Zoom fatigue?
Emma, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that excellent question. You know, we're all news consumers. And many of us are news producers as well. We all know kind of the cacophony of that we're assaulted by every day in our media landscape. And I'm going to put news and information in one bucket because there's all kinds of information that we need, whether for our own lives or our families' lives or our kids' lives or whatever, and information we want. And then there's news. Now, sometimes news can overlap with those other categories of what we need and what we want, but not usually. And in the kind of hierarchy of needs, news is actually very close to the bottom. People, most users prefer social, search, and shows, I'll say, to kind of all that is before news as far as what they care about and what animates them. So we are really trying to break through this incredibly loud, incredible landscape that actually users care much more about the other pieces of it than us. And so push notifications is one way we try to do that. We kind of knock on your closed screen to say, hi, here's something important, look at this. We're all getting, I think, more and more sophisticated on our strategies of what push notifications we should do, whether or not it matters if you open the screen or if we're fine with the closed screen experience. There's been lots of experimentation, of course, in the past on that. What we're trying to do right now, I think all news producers, is figure out how in a post-Trump world to give you content diversity that you care about. And we're also trying to mix up both kind of news that's kind of high-level geopolitics or what's happening in Washington with the information that's closer to home that maybe in the old days we wouldn't even call news, like what's happening on your corner or what's happening with the schools where you are or what's happening with the COVID vaccination and infection rates in your city or in your zip code. So we're trying to make it essential in a way news hasn't really been made essential in the past. In the past we put out way back to the days of Gutenberg, we put out one newspaper for everybody. We're trying to change that experience where it's actually the most relevant pieces of information to you when you need it at the most important times to cut through exactly that cacophonous, landscape and the fact that we're all fatigued with quote unquote news. We're trying to expand the very definition of news and serve it up to users in a way that's important and essential for them, not just for any old body, but for them, because that's the only way we stay relevant. And the only way users are going to keep coming to us.
Yeah, I mean, Craig, in your philanthropic endeavors, you work a lot on projects with an eye to keeping the public engaged and educated. So can you talk a little bit about your strategy to support journalism as a way of achieving that? Because, as Marcus said, news tends to be at the bottom of the list of their needs. And so how do you help get news how do you see news fitting into that engaged, educated force that you're working on?
In my naivete, what I do is talk to people, and what they're looking for is news which they can see as trustworthy. That means having a code of ethics and then following through with it, correcting things even when mistakes are made, because no matter how hard you try, news is really difficult business. It's really challenging. So people look for that follow through when it comes to just how trustworthy that news is. People are also looking to be represented fairly and uniformly through the news. And we're beginning to see a whole bunch of projects along those lines, spearheaded by folks included at the CUNY Journalism School and the Center for Community Media, particularly the work of Aaron Foley. For me personally, there's this Oscar Wilde quote which says, if you want to tell people the truth, make them laugh, otherwise they'll kill you. But there may be a limited amount of news presented in that style, given that Colbert and John Oliver have taken over for Jon Stewart.
Yeah, go ahead, Lauren.
Oh no, I was gonna say that what Marcus was saying really resonated with me. Most recently I was the editor-in-chief of Vox, and one of the things that we always really focused on at Vox is filling audience needs. I think, a lot of, elite journalists and journalism organizations often look down a little upon the idea that, letting the audience guide you with what their questions are is sort of not really how journalism should work. We're the gatekeepers. We make the decision on what's important, and we give it to this audience that doesn't, really, know what their needs are. Right. At Vox, we looked a lot at Google searches. What are people asking today about the news? And let's answer it. And that's not, cheap or cutting journalistic corners. That's serving an audience. And with Capital B, which is a new nonprofit local and national news organization that I'm launching for Black Americans, we want to continue that. We, particularly in our, local bureaus, want to serve the basic information needs that people have. That intersection of sometimes what's news, but sometimes what is just information about how to live your lives and how to make decisions that are important for you and your families, and having the information to do that. And part of being able to do that is doing a lot of listening, doing a lot of understanding of what the community's needs are and what the audience's needs are and what the biggest questions are, so that you can serve them. And one way to break through some of this fatigue is to be really targeted in how you're serving the communities that you're purporting to be serving.
Yeah,
it's such a good point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. That idea that, we journalists sit on this mountaintop and we will give you the news like they're the commandments, like we know what news is and you're going to listen. It's such an old-fashioned kind of way of thinking, but despite, the kind of what we used to call a producer push environment versus a consumer pull environment. And we've been in this consumer pull environment for a long time, with users deciding what they want to watch, listen to, or read, and when they want to watch, listen, or read, right? But it's really new, and it's true. There's this kind of arrogance, I'd say, traditionally in journalism, where we know what the news is and we're going to tell you. That is valid sometimes, especially when we're talking about geopolitics or some kind of inside the beltway politics stuff. Most users, most Americans, most people around the world don't know about the intricacies of, say, what's happening in Lebanon, right? So there is still a role for expert journalists. But when it comes to what information a user wants, we won't even be relevant, and the user won't be there to get this other news that we think we want to give them from an expert point of view if we're not essential to the questions that they have in living their lives, and often in being engaged in our world, right? Often politically, and to make a difference. And they don't want to sit back and consume. I think this is especially true of Gen Z. I mean, I have two Gen Zers who are, mine are only 11 years old, but I've seen it in the older members of that generation too. They are dedicated to changing things. And as much as you say, oh, well, we've always done something this way, here are the parameters through which we look at these questions, they rebel against that. They say, well, your parameters are wrong. The questions you're asking are wrong. And so it's even more important, I think, that we listen to the audience and to the users and to what they want and the questions they're asking. And Google is one good way to do that. And there are lots of other ways in social networks, et cetera, to listen to the conversations that are happening and to join those conversations, and sometimes ask those users to come and bring those conversations onto our platforms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, months into us all, I mean, the collective news industry obsessively covering the pandemic, we found that people, the top searches were still, what is coronavirus? Like, they're not, people are not necessarily on the same journey that, journalists deep into the topic are. And so then you step back and say, okay, well, we answered this, or we explained this 3 months ago, but people right now still have this question. So what is another way to get at this, to reach those people who deserve answers to this? Because they are not necessarily reading the news every day, but how are we going to engage with these people with this incredibly important news and not make them feel like they, the story has passed them by, or they will, start reading a lead and not even understand the context, so they, give up on it. You have to be thinking this way if you really want to affect meaningful change and reach a wide audience. You have to be thinking about how, non-journalists follow the news and think about the news.
Yeah, and I like to call it sort of eat your vegetable journalism versus click, as you said, sort of bottom up or click chasing journalism, because there's obviously a tension between those things. And how do we make sure that we are creating an informed public, and we are building a system where you are getting both the traffic and the clicks and the readers and the engaged audience, while also delivering the news that they really do need to know. And sometimes that can be often that's a real challenge. And so, I mean, Craig, I know you think about this a lot. So what is your perspective for how to tackle that kind of attention, and where can we sort of fill the gaps in between just keeping the news flow under working?
All I can think of is, repeating a previous point, produce news that people can trust, get to the point, and then let people get on with their lives. For example, one news brand advertises smart brevity, and that's very appealing to me as a human who consumes a lot of news, but is trying to do other things. I'd like to hear more from you, Emma, though.
Yeah, well, I think that it's an interesting question, because we're all trying to figure out what the right delivery mechanism is, and we're all managing this dance between, okay, we have this consumer business, or we have this click-based business, or we have this audience, and how are we serving them and making sure that they are engaged, while also figuring out, okay, people do go to the New York Times homepage. People do go to the CNN homepage to figure out what is the news that I need to know about for the day, and to make myself be an informed person. But there's obviously side door traffic, and social platforms are a huge part of that, and that's a huge percentage of homepage driver readership, and a huge percentage of Lauren, as you start out with capital B, you'll be able to drive engagement and get more people to talk about the story and your brand by social sharing and promotion in that regard. And so I don't have an answer to that, except to try and figure out where do we fit all these different pieces, and can we build a platform where we're creating an audience engagement and a space of trust in our coverage, so that people do keep coming back, or do trust that something that they're seeing in the platforms or on the social platforms is something that they want to click through. And then you've got, of course, the downstream of the sidebar surfacing of stories and other elements like that, but to drive engagement once people get to your platform. But it's an interesting question. Absolutely. I do want to talk a little bit more about the noise effect on engagement, and especially back to the original question: are people tired of the news? I mean, obviously, 4 years ago there was a lot of industry talk about record subscription revenue and peak readership as Trump moved into the White House. But now, of course, the noise exhaustion combined with a return to normal White House communications are we all afraid that that's going to have an impact on the business, and bottom lines? I don't know, Marcus, thoughts?
Yeah, time will tell, right? The revenue numbers will tell us right away. I think we all expect it. I think we all expect there to be some decreased interest. But because Trump was it's almost like, I mean, I've covered, as a foreign correspondent in the past, I've covered dictatorships, and the dictator's job is always to insinuate himself into your brain and into all the spaces, so you're never free of thought about him. And Trump had that authoritarian kind of, impulse to encrust himself into our consciousness, into our everyday lives. And there was, one must admit, a positive, business impact to that for media companies, because you had to watch what was the crazy thing he was doing next. That's not true in a more normal, let's say, political environment. And so there's less of a need to watch what we're publishing, because there's less craziness, right? Period. And to use a technical term, and so it does mean that we're not as necessary for that as a safeguard against what the most powerful person in the world may be up to. But I feel like that gives us so much of an opening to content diversity, to all the stuff that users may care about that they actually weren't getting from us before, because we quite literally didn't have the bandwidth to give it to them. Because now we can actually talk about whether it's crime and social justice, whether it's criminal justice reform, whether it's other social issues, whether it's the environment, whatever you care about more. We have more bandwidth to actually bring it to our users now. And we keep kind of dancing around this idea of the Lauren talked about it, I think, to go from not just engagement but empowerment, to allow us to be a vehicle to and allow users to engage with their world, and to then have the power to affect change in their world. And that's huge. And we had some space for that in the Trumpian era, but I think with the end of the Trump era we have more, and the decrease in noise, we have more of an opportunity now to make for a much more fulfilling, engaged, and kind of less terrified experience with our users. And that for news publishers to be able to engage with you in that world, kind of all the myriad facets of who you are as a user and as a human being, that's phenomenal. I mean, that to me is really liberating for us and for our audiences. So I think it's a real opportunity. And the question is, how do you identify the people who want to engage, but also how do you empower? How do you identify those in your audience who want to be empowered to affect change? And how do you help them to do that? How do you help them come together in community, on your platforms, connect with each other to do that? I think that's kind of the big challenge we have right now.
I would say I'm sorry, Craig. I would say that the business effect of like the Donald Trump sort of news frenzied news landscape is like very different depending on the area of the business, because all of the news of the Donald Trump era they were not boom years for digital media, for instance, where advertisers did not want to advertise on stories that had Donald Trump's name on them. So even if you got record traffic on it, which many of these stories did, that didn't necessarily translate to revenue. And so, but I agree with what Marcus said, that this presents a really fascinating and amazing opportunity, both for journalists exhausted from 4 years of covering this outrageous endless news cycle, and for audiences, because there's so many stories, there's so many opportunities now to go deeper and to go more diverse on what's being covered and what's being uncovered, that I think it's a really good opportunity to sort of remake and reset relationships between news organizations and audiences.
Well, I'm going to cut to the chase. The problem with noise in news is a deliberate, explicit strategy both of our foreign adversaries who quite openly talk about what Steve Bannon, I think, called flooding the zone with crap. I think he used a less polite word. The problem was noise exhaustion was an explicit strategy of our foreign adversaries and the people whose talking points, well, were the same ones. That was explicit, but about a month ago, with the voice of our adversaries limited, all of a sudden there's much less news exhaustion. People are beginning to feel a sense of hope, and that's working out pretty well. I would like to think this is because of better professional practice of news ethics, like preventing the amplification of information. And I'm hoping that's not just a flash in the pan. I'm hoping that more and more news operations will just stop amplifying disinformation and then give a voice to people who don't get heard enough.
It's
Yeah,
a
I mean,
real
I
good
think
question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah. Oh no, I was going to ask a question exactly like that. I mean, and to you, Marcus. I mean, we're asking a lot of our readers and our viewers. We're asking them to be able to discern the difference between fake news and real news, and that in and of itself can be exhausting. So add it to everything else that we're talking about. What can we do about it? What should we do about it?
It's we're working explicitly. I mean, we're one publisher working explicitly to do it, but so many are to actually do. We've done the fact checking and the debunking for a while, but we're really aiming at disinformation. What is the difference in disinformation? How is it built? What is the kind of landscape and modalities of communication and technology, frankly, that it relies on to be propagated around the internet sphere and our social platforms. So we're covering it in a different way, I think a more sophisticated way, and trying to empower our users to be aware of disinformation and how it's constructed and how it's made, and also how they themselves, again, empowerment, right? How they can go out and debunk it. So that's super. I mean, so many of us are dedicated to that right now as an area of coverage and a piece of our journalism. I think more than ever in the history of the craft. And so I'm super excited about that. But there is, and when Craig was speaking, it made me think of this challenge we have. How do we talk about this information without amplifying it? To some extent, anything like, say we put it on our URLs, or we send it around on our homepage, send it around the world. CNN is the largest English language news publisher on the planet Earth right now. So we take this piece of crap, use one of those Bannon, a politer term of a Bannon term, and then when we talk about it, even as we're trying to dispel the lie of it, we are amplifying it, and for so long we were frankly afraid at CNN to even confront this stuff because we were afraid we'd be amplifying it. What we realized was, to go to that Washington Post, motto about democracy dies in darkness. So does truth, right? If we are not taking this crap and bringing it to the light, it's going to keep proliferating down in the darkness and in dark spaces, and keep taking. We've done tons of pieces on it. For instance, young white men and perverting their sense of truth and reality, and feeding on their sense of isolation individually and collectively, and creating people who are going to storm the Capitol of the United States. And so we have a responsibility to dive in deep and to bring this stuff to light, but we're still worried about how do we do it without amplifying it and giving it more power. And I don't know how to square that conundrum. Maybe it's not possible, but at least I'm happy we're more dedicated than ever to actually going at it and empowering our audiences to see it and to confront it and to debunk it. Because I think that's the only way we move forward. Because I think the problem's not going to go away anytime soon, if ever.
Yeah, I have two thoughts on that. One is the truth sandwich, where you don't you don't amplify the lie or the disinformation in a headline, and then in a piece you sandwich the falsehood between two truths, right? So it can never kind of stand alone. That it is totally imperfect, but one sort of tool to not further amplify the disinformation in the act of trying to debunk it. But I think the other thing is playing offense more than just defense when the disinformation comes out. And the fact of the matter is that an enormous problem in playing offense is the death nationwide of local news, of news that understands your community and that you can trust. And what is able to fill the void there is conspiracy theories and blatantly false misinformation and disinformation on social media. And what we're trying to do with capital B in our local bureaus is really play offense. We want to combat misinformation by giving people what they are not getting at all, which is trustworthy local news that understands your specific community. And I think that is, obviously it's an enormous problem to solve because it is an enormous nationwide issue, but it's a huge piece of the puzzle of, when the trustworthy local news isn't there, there's going to be, disinformation, misinformation filling those holes.
The good news is that there's an extensive network of organizations working together and to some extent working with folks in Washington to both better understand disinformation warfare and then actually do something about it. There's folks like at the Stanford Internet Observatory, Renee DiResta and Alex Stamos, Joan Donovan at Harvard, and then there's the work going on at Aspen Digital. The good news is even better in that there are eloquent proponents of things like the truth sandwich, best known as Margaret Sullivan at the Post, although we do want to give credit to George Lakoff, who I think invented the concept. But even better, there is a few people at something called CNN, Brian Stelter, Donny O'Sullivan, and Oliver Darcy, who are fighting a war against disinformation
And
every
Daniel Dale.
day. Well, that's true, Daniel Dale and many others actually. But every day, Brian and Oliver put out something called Reliable Sources, which, as a minor patriotic thing I do, is I tweet the thing out normally before they have a chance to. And the idea is that real things are happening. And I admire the courage of the folks doing this because when you do it, you're sticking your neck out and you might wind up annoying people in power, or like the folks at the International Fact Checking Network, you might get under the skin of people who fight very dirty. The thing is, one can encourage folks doing this, one can help fund them, and one can help protect them.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I in particular want to sort of get back to is the role of social media in this and the proliferation of fake news. So obviously we can sit in our, call it ivory tower, and say, this is news and this is not news and this is what you should know. But our social media platforms, are they partners in this? Are they not partners? We've obviously seen some interesting moves forward in Twitter's banning of Donald Trump and in Amazon Web Services dropping of Parler. But what is that heading in the right direction, or is that something that is that smoke and mirrors that we still continue to need to be vigilant? Are they partners, or are they going to be problems in this area? Anyone? Marcus, I guess.
I think we have to acknowledge that they are partners, and there's a difference in how they've reacted, right? I don't say this just as a former tweet, but I think Twitter has been more proactive than Facebook. I don't think there's really any debate about that. Is it enough? One can say it's not enough. Twitter started with this kind of philosophy of kind of free speech kind of thing. and it was really idealistic. I don't think Facebook started with those same roots. You can say Twitter never really succeeded at it, and there's massive amounts of harassment, obviously, on the platform. But I don't think everyone's the same in social media platforms. I don't think they're all the same. So I think Facebook has more work to do. I do think that, just objectively speaking. I don't think any of them are doing enough. They all have to do more. I'm not quite sure where they're going to find the balance between trying to be platforms for all and trying to protect their audiences from the most disgusting and disinformation and even deadly disinformation. And I think that's really important, right? At the same time, and this is I look to all of you guys in our entire industry for, even for those of us in traditional media, I'm not quite sure how do we, because keep coming back to trust, right? In such a divided nation, how do we cultivate trust and get those who are, say, on a conservative tilt? And there's a spectrum there too, right? There are those who believe what Donald Trump says to be truthful, and that is a shocking large proportion of our population, even though it's a minority proportion. They think that it's true when it's lies. How do we get anyone on that spectrum or even closer into the center, but who's just a conservative who feels like their points of views are not reflected in mainstream media? How do we get them to trust us, and how do we rebuild that trust? And can we really have a kind of a comedy amongst our polity if we don't increase that trust? And I don't know the answer to it, and we're trying every day. We don't want CNN just to be the place for for liberals and progressives. We want it to be the place for everybody who wants fact-based news, and we keep saying that. But I'm not quite sure, how do we educate folks who believe stuff that's not true? I don't know how to reach them. Maybe you guys have ideas.
Well, I'd love to actually go to Lauren on this specifically, because you're starting a new venture and you're starting from scratch, and what you're not trying to move the huge legacy ship, but really have the opportunity to be a bit nimble. So you've got a whole different set of challenges in that, but also an opportunity to start a new brand. And so how do you think about misinformation and being bastion of truth as you're also trying to leverage social platforms to grow your brand?
Mm-hmm. I mean, and there's obviously just an enormous trust in media divide that splits along ideological lines, but I think that there's also a sort of racial trust in media issue where the media has historically failed to tell Black stories and in equitable ways, and to treat Black audiences as equal and important parts of a share of audience. And so Capital B, which is focusing on Black communities, I think has some real interesting work to do in creating and building those audience communities that trust the work that we're going to do. Starting from scratch means that we can go to our communities and do community listening, and have no sort of preconceived notions, or there being a certain way that it's always been done. And we can find ways to really reach people in exactly the ways that they most want to be reached, and give people the information that they most need. And it's the thing that I'm kind of most excited about in launching Capital B, is tailoring the local news that we're doing to the community's needs in a really real way, without the barriers of legacy. Now, I don't think certainly doesn't solve the problem of misinformation on social media, and I think we all know the ways in which Black and brown communities have been explicitly targeted, particularly like in swing states or during elections, for misinformation and disinformation that is meant to exacerbate racial tensions or keep Black people from the polls. And that is something that is a pillar of Capital B for us to very specifically fight against. But I struggle to say what Marcus said, which is that social media companies are our partners. I don't know that I see that. They certainly, it would be great if they were, and it would be great if it really felt that way. And I do see, you know, moves in the right direction on combating misinformation and disinformation, but there is so far to go. And so, like I said earlier, part of this is just really attempting to, um, flood the zone as much as we can in places where, the news hasn't existed for a long time, and, fight misinformation and disinformation that way.
In terms of the disinformation issue, the ethics of news distribution says don't amplify disinformation, or if you want to go really, really old school, you don't want to bear false witness. And I'm not very smart. I can only work with people at mid to high levels at the social media platforms, reminding them to do what they already know is the right thing and to talk to their management. Beyond that, again, to illustrate the vastness of my ignorance, when I'm looking to help people out with funding or even influence, I just find people who are good at their jobs. I mentioned Aaron Foley at CUNY Journalism School, but there's a lot of people who help me out, give good advice, and then do good work. Let's say at the Howard University J School or the Maynard Institute. The idea is that there's a large networks of people coming together to do things like fighting disinformation, but also to give a voice to people who've never had a voice. I guess my job is to, help fund them, help get the word out. And the only thing I ask, which is a terrible burden, is to put up with my sense of humor. But nevertheless, we are making progress. It's actually accelerating this year. The idea is to just never stop.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point actually about the looking inside, because we've talked a lot about external messaging and how do we reach external audiences and new voices and all that. But there's a lot that we can do on the inside, and with training and the next generation of journalists, and like you just mentioned, journalism school. But also, how are we making sure that we have an inclusive and diverse group of people inside the building, so that we are asking the right questions and reaching out to the right people and telling the right stories. And maybe actually right stories is the wrong thing to say. It's telling diverse stories and interesting stories, regardless of racial demographic or escalating issues that maybe have been whitewashed in the past. And what can we do from the inside? And Craig, just to go back to you very briefly, because I know you do a lot of work with organizations like Press Forward to help create inclusive newsrooms. How can we leverage what our internal resources to help maybe solve the question, the downstream effect of noise and the importance of capital J journalism?
In my case, I find people who are good at their job making things, trying to make things fair for everyone, and again, help them get the word out, which often they're not very good at, help them protect themselves. Because if you're good at, let's say, posting trustworthy news, that's going to raise your profile for some rather bad people. Protecting people is a big deal. I mentioned the International Fact Checking Network. They've gotten under the skin of people who play really rough. So we're trying to help out there. And again, the only thing to ask of people seriously is to put up with my sense of humor. I do have a comedy tutor now, but he says I shouldn't really hope for much.
Marcus, do you have thoughts as someone who runs an extremely large newsroom?
Yeah. We just, we're so, the reckoning that happened last summer was to so many of us of color in the business. We were both thankful and grateful that it finally happened, that our majority colleagues were like, yeah, we get it, and there's an issue here, and systemic racism is in our newsroom, and it is one of the backbones of our newsroom. That was really gratifying. At the same time, it was also massively frustrating, because we had been saying this for decades, or for our whole careers, and now people got it. So it's great they get it. And then how do we root it out? How do we confront it? Because the decisions, hiring and firing and promotion decisions we make every day, that we often say, oh, it's just attached to work or news, or what they've done. It's attached to so much more than that, right? The systemic unconscious biases that run through everybody in the newsroom makes a difference, and it's why our newsrooms look the way they look. And I feel very privileged to get to sit around as a poor Black kid raised by a single mom from Trenton. I feel very privileged to get around that newsroom at CNN, editorial space, whether virtual or in reality, and prior to that, the New York Times, and for that Newsweek. But I'm like usually the only one. Even still, I'm usually the only one, and that's not acceptable. So we have to work really hard, whoever we are. Black, white, Latinx, Asian, otherwise, Native American, otherwise, LGBTQ, et cetera. We have to work hard, straight. We have to work hard to change that dynamic, to bring talented people who are diverse into our newsrooms, to find them. Internships are the easiest way to do it. That kind of thing. Start with paid internships, get people out of school, but then promote the ones who are in our organization. Because a lot of us are very good at getting entry-level people, but then you see, our upper echelons, editors, VPs, SVPs. It's not, no one's there. And then again, that's where's the opportunity given, and where does systemic racism play a part in that? And if we're not conscious about fighting that and making a difference, it's not ever going to change. So we start there internally. That's where we have to start, being dedicated to rooting out internal systemic racism and figuring out how can we get opportunities to the talented people, so opportunities don't always go to the same people who look exactly the same demographically in our newsrooms. So we start there. And if we get the right diverse people around the table, we'll see that the stories we tell and that we're interested in will automatically change. It's like magic, And it's hard. I don't want to say this is easy, because dealing with entrenched stuff that's been around for 400 years is not easy. And people feel like, it comes down to who has an opportunity, me or this person. And so newsrooms are very sensitive about that. So we have to be dedicated and intentional.
Yeah, I'm starting a Black news organization, and it's part of an internal motivation for us, setting aside the audience that we want to serve, is to create a network, a much larger network than exists now, of Black journalists who are trained in investigative and accountability journalism, who deeply rooted in their communities and doing local journalism, who can then move into mainstream journalism. I think in like 10 years, if they're capital B journalists at the New York Times and the LA Times and all the newspapers or digital news outlets in between, I feel like we will have been really, really successful in one of our big internal goals, which is to push some mainstream news organizations to make these hires, and to empower a generation of young Black journalists to know their voice, and to have some real career development as they move on and up in their careers. Because right now, what Marcus said, there is a pipeline, despite what people say, of a ton of entry-level journalists, but somewhere along the line, Black journalists end up dropping out of the business. And, plenty of different reasons for that, but you look at it as a whole, and it's because this business doesn't promote us, doesn't foster our careers, and, how long can you see other people get opportunities before you just decide to leave? And that's the thing that has to stop. And the journalism can't change until that stops.
Yeah.
In our world, in our culture, the pandemic has accelerated a transition from normal to some kind of new normal. lots of people have the opportunity to ascend, to rise, that never have. People in institutions are paying lip service to that. Some of them mean it. The job now is to make sure that the kind of change we're talking about sticks, so that people are not only talking about making things more fair for everyone, but that it's for real. We need to do what we can to that effect, and we need to do that relentlessly, but only as long as we live.
Well, we've only got about 30 seconds left, but I do want to do a very quick round robin on this, if we can even touch on it briefly. But what have we learned from 2020? Are you optimistic about the future? Craig, you want to start?
Well, I'm in the thick, although mostly quietly, about working with networks of people who are trying to make things better for everyone across a pretty broad spectrum. So I am optimistic. But again, the message is to not only talk about making things better, to not only intend to, but then to act on it. My limitations, though, I'm a 1950s nerd, and to really make things better, regard what many people call social skills, which is why I help other people get there, fund them, and so on, and then get out of their way, unless, of course, it's funny.
Lauren?
Well, the events of 2020 were part of what inspired me to leave Vox and start, a nonprofit news organization. And so there is like deep hope baked into that, that, this is a moment where there is opportunity for change, which doesn't mean that change is definitely going to happen, but the opportunity for change is there if people seize it. And I decided I wanted to seize it. And so I am hopeful.
Marcus, last word?
Yeah, I'd say 2020, it was a crucible. And the fact that we came through it proved that we were more resilient than I sometimes in my darkest moments thought we could be. And so I find myself surprisingly optimistic too, because I'm not always the most optimistic person. But the gift of that trauma of 2020 was, I think, the belief that we can survive anything, and that hope that is the kernel of any entrepreneurship, as Lauren laid out. That's I think we all have a piece of that. So I'm optimistic.
I agree. I am too. I think it's going to be, it's important that we continue to have this conversation, that we continue to be frank about the challenges that we're facing, and just continue to share insights. Lauren, Marcus, Greg, thank you so much for sharing your insights and for joining this conversation today. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.